For Real News is sponsored by assholes like you, so pay up, motherfucker. There. So, and if there is no hierarchy, then really it's sort of the equivalent of a mob rule, which is exactly what you see with these Antifa gangs, that they go around and they rove and attack, and it's, you know, how is this different from the Hells Angels? Are the Hells Angels a socialist organization? Because they don't have, so they have somewhat of a hierarchy, but not really. I mean, you could make the argument that, you know, there's chapter leaders or whatever, but in many cases these chapter leaders don't have true authority over their gang members, because the more restrictive they get, the less people want to be part of the gang.
They manifested in Catalonia, Spain, right before World War II. In this instance, socialism worked. Almost all industries and aspects of the economy were collectivized, and society functioned efficiently without capitalism or money. Catalonia was able to provide quality health care for its 2.5 million inhabitants. Under anarco-syndicalism, Catalonia saw a growth in wealth and production, and absence of poverty. More schools were built all around, objectively better public services were provided, and they had a highly effective military which they constantly used to protect themselves against the Spanish nationalist forces during the Spanish Civil War.
Okay, what he's doing right now is he's condensing a topic into really a short period of time. So what he's leaving out is the fact that the anarco-syndicalists in Spain, I think they were called the CNT. First of all, they themselves were a chaotic and cruel society. That there are instances when they would dig up the graves of dead nuns and perform mock masses in front of them, and they would murder priests. They committed some of the most horrific atrocities of the Spanish-American War, or the Spanish Civil War, sorry, where which is one of the wars where you kind of wonder which side is worse, the nationalists who were, you know, actual fascists under Franco, or these wackos, and to some degree, I mean, to some degree, it wasn't just the nationalists that these anarcho-syndicalists were fighting, but the Stalinist elements of the rest of the Spanish Republic, which was the side they were on. One of the reasons, and this is something that Pakman leaves out, and I could direct you towards sources if you want. I'll try to post a source on it. One of the reasons that the nationalists won in this 3-year civil war was that the Republican side, or they were the left side. You know, if Republican is kind of a strange word nowadays because we associate with the Republican Party, but back then it was the Republican left of Spain. They failed because of massive divisions between different socialist groups over what vision they would pursue for the entire country if they would win the Civil War. There were people who wanted traditional, they wanted a traditional liberal state. There were people who were hardcore Stalinist, ideologues. Many of them were anarchists, such as the ones that Pakman's talking about. But what he's trying to attribute is that there was, this was a 3-year period when they controlled Catalonia in Spain. I mean, they had a lot of influence before the war, but they by no means really controlled the region for a long period of time. In fact, this is a much shorter period of time to gauge the success of their revolution than what's happened in Venezuela. So can he really claim that socialism worked there when in many cases they claim that these socialists, they claim that they don't have enough time to implement their policies, or they can't implement it enough? Well, in 3 years, these people, they managed to, decimate Catholic churches in the Catalonia region. They managed to commit horrific crimes during the war itself, and maybe they succeeded in doing some of these structural societal changes that Pakman's talking about. But this is one of the worst cases you could pick because the time sample isn't long enough, and He's ignoring much of the context by omitting the fact that they were fighting with other communists at the same time that they were fighting with the nationalists in Spain.
George Orwell described what he saw when he visited Catalonia in the 1930s. It was the first time I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. This shows you what human beings are like when they are trying to behave as human beings and not as cogs in the capitalist machine.
Okay, what he's leaving out is that this was Orwell's account from 1938 when the Civil War was still going on. It's called Homage to Catalonia. I will try to do, I might do a project on this. Of course, I have tons of projects going on anyway. But he leaves out what happened after this. And Christopher Hitchens talks about this. He says, the narrative core of Homage to Catalonia, it might be argued, is a series of events that occurred in and around the Barcelona telephone exchange in early May 1937. Orwell was a witness to these events by the relative accident of his having signed up with a militia, the anti-Stalinist POUM, upon arriving in Spain. He became convinced that he had been the spectator of a full-blown Stalinist putsch. Moreover, he came to understand that much of the talk about discipline and unity was a rhetorical shield for the covert Stalinization of the Spanish Republic. Then it continues on April 26, 1937, when Orwell and his ILP comrades, the ILP was this international group that was volunteering for the war effort on the Republican side, had returned to Barcelona on their leave. They had been shocked to see how things had changed. The revolutionary atmosphere of 4 months earlier had all but evaporated and old class divisions been reasserted. Similarly, as he headed for the French border on the train to Port Bou, Orwell noticed another symptom of the change since his arrival. The train on which his classes had been abolished had both first-class compartments and a dining car. Orwell mused that coming to Spain the previous year, bourgeois-looking people would be turned back at the border by anarchist guards. Now, looking bourgeois gave one easy passage. A simple hostility to Stalinist communism became a deep-eyed loathing of it. He had learned a hard lesson, especially about the new political Europe. Totalitarianism, the new creed of the streamlined men of fascism and communism, was a new manifestation of Orwell's old Catholic enemy, the doctrine of absolutism. The ghost of Torquemada had arisen from imprisonment without trial, confessions extracted under torture, with summary executions to follow. So what Pakman is doing here is blatant dishonesty, because he's using an earlier account by Orwell before he became disillusioned with communism to justify the Spanish Catalonian or the Catalonian anarchist regime. The fact is that it was a weak enough regime that the Stalinists undermined it and took over, because it's anarchy. Eventually, with anarchy, somebody takes over and ends the anarchy.
Anarco-syndicalist communities also exist today in Chiapas, Mexico, which first developed in the 1990s under the Zapatista movement. Today, they successfully provide adequate education and healthcare services for themselves. They have sustainable and ecologically sound agricultural practices, which provide more than enough food, and they are champions of women's rights and the rights of indigenous Mexicans. And
there you have it, folks. Move to Chiapas, Mexico. I bet all of you are begging to go there. If Chiapas, Mexico is so awesome, then how come the rest of Mexico isn't moving to Chiapas?
Many other types of socialist anarchism. By the way, socialist anarchism should be redundant because things like anarco-capitalism present oppressive economic hierarchies of authority that are inherently non-anarchistic, but with all of the ANCAPs running around on the internet these days, it's worth just clarifying that point. Beyond
so anarcho-communism makes sense because why? The fact is that I don't believe in either of these theories because, I think eventually things shake out that people rise to the top. The people that are really ambitious rise to the top. Doesn't matter what system it is. They just find different ways to fuck other people. And that's the way human nature is. And that's why we need a society of fewer laws and fewer constraints where people can abuse those laws. And that's why I think that, as much as I'm not an anarchist, I do believe in, minimizing intrusion on people's lives and minimizing coercion. So if you really look hard, there's been no example of a society that's degenerated into chaos and later fallen under dictatorship because of anarco-capitalism, because I don't think that there's really been many examples of it being implemented. But his anarcho-communism example did exactly that. It did exactly that. It degenerated to a point where the Stalinists did take over, and they did enforce a totalitarian regime with a top-down hierarchy.
Anarchism, there is democratic socialism and social democracy, which seek to implement the principles of socialism in the context of a democratic and sometimes capitalist state. Principles like equality, social justice, environmentalism, civil liberties, free speech. Democratic socialism and social democracy differ from anarchism, obviously, because there is a state. They differ from Marxism because they're frequently thought of as systems that are achieved through reform as opposed to revolution, or they're thought of as vehicles for reform to something else, and they also don't carry many of the other characteristics of Marxism. Democratic socialism and social democracy are often considered more centrist than Marxism or anarchism, and according to many, are even compatible with capitalism, or at least some elements of capitalism. In other words, in democratic socialism and social democracies, you can have markets, but the state provides a great deal of regulation and social welfare. Distinctions are sometimes made between democratic socialism and social democracy, in that democratic socialist states will ensure that major factions of industry are publicly owned, while social democracies tend to exist within more capitalist frameworks. Currently, no countries in the world really fit the description of democratic socialism. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez claimed to be democratic. And still is, by the way, just another right-wing, oppressive, authoritarian type of socialism.
Oh, right-wing socialism. First of all, let's clarify that. For many on the left are incapable of acknowledging that socialism can in any way be a right-wing philosophy. I think that the idea that anything, first of all, this left-right paradigm is bullshit. Okay, just like I saw Yaron Brooks' presentation on the Sargon live stream a couple days ago, a brilliant statement that when you have left-right, you need a third dimension, which is libertarianism versus authoritarianism, and it's represented in a lot of different models nowadays. That there's the social and economic rights, and lefts. And if you look at Hugo Chavez's regime, it is democratic socialist up until a certain point. And then what does democratic socialism lead to? It leads to dictatorship, because in order to fully implement the aims of a socialist revolution, you cannot have people suddenly switching on you midstream and going against you. You need that top-down control. You need that hierarchy, because you need to synchronize everybody. Everybody has to be on the same page, and everybody has to drink from the same trough. Otherwise, it's not equal. Otherwise, people are not getting the they're not getting the full experience of it, and that's why to say that he's not democratic social. I mean, he's dead now, but his regime is not democratic socialist. Well, at the time, democratic socialists were saying that he was a democratic socialist. They were claiming him all the time. Now they suddenly disown him. Well, it's not that he did not become it's not that he stopped being a democratic socialist. It's that he reached the end of the tether of what democratic socialism affords you, which is it gets you into power. But in order to maintain power, socialists must then dismantle the participatory elements of democracy. And that's what he's been doing. That's what he did. That's what his successor, Maduro, has done. They didn't start out annulling powers of Parliament. I mean, they began with a new constitution. The new constitution expanded presidential powers. Then they nationalized more industries. They did a lot more cooperation with Cuba, but that's not really a structural issue. When did it stop being democratic socialist? It has nothing to do with the fact that nowadays Venezuela is no longer a real democracy. Does not mean that he was not a democratic socialist, because he took power through democratic means, and he was reelected, under democratic mandates. So I don't think that you can, as much as people want to besmirch the fact that now they don't want him as a democratic socialist. Too bad. The process started with him as a democratic socialist. Then, he may have betrayed the theoretical dictates of it, but that does not make him not a democratic socialist. Just like you can look at many of these other leaders. Ronald Reagan betrayed a number of ideas of conservatism. He didn't abolish the welfare state. So does that make him not a conservative? No. Liberals are never going to accept him as a conservative. This is the same thing where the no true Scotsman thing. They do it both on the left and the right. I do it sometimes. I mean, I'll admit it, but it's never truer than on the left and with democratic socialists, because once they see elements of these regimes, they start baring their teeth, showing their true colors, throwing off their sheep's clothing. Then they say, oh, it's not really democratic socialism, it's totalitarianism. Well, it was always going to be totalitarianism, because otherwise, how does the socialism remain in power? How are they supposed to continue to make their gains when the worsening conditions under socialism lead to the loss of mayoral races and governors' races and then the National Assembly, which is exactly what happened. And they started eliminating many of these positions. They eliminated the mayor of Caracas. They stole powers from the governors. They tried to rewrite, they had a referendum to give decree powers to the president that failed. So then they did it by fixing the legislature for a while and concentrating power in his hands, through the legislature. So is that democracy? The fact that they took power through democracy makes them democratic socialists. But the democratic socialists don't govern democratically. They only take power democratically.
There are a handful of countries today that can be accurately described as social democracies. Modern social democracies allow egalitarianism, things like social welfare, universal health care, and represent democracy to flourish within the context of capitalism. Think of countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Sweden. So modern social democracy is sometimes referred to as the Nordic model. These countries have free college, free graduate school, free or inexpensive world-class healthcare, paid through taxes. Compared to other developed countries, generally speaking, they have lower rates of crime and a higher quality of life. Socialism has been used to solve economic...
Okay, so I'm going to say something, kind of edgy here, but yes, they did have lower rates of crime. They did have lower rates of, disharmony, or, I don't know if they're rates, but they had lower elements of disharmony because for many, many years, these were very homogeneous societies. There was very little immigration of whatever type into Northern Europe. And for many years, indeed, there was out-migration from Northern Europe. They were immigrating to the Americas. But let me give you an idea of why this is a ridiculous place to use socialism as an example, or social democracy. There's been studies, and I have this book. It's called Debunking Utopia by Nimat, I think his name's Nimas Anandaji. Brilliant book, where it shows that these societies, they have very cooperative cultures, especially in Sweden and Norway and Finland, in fact. and they already are geared towards cooperative partnerships. That's why their corporations do so well, and therefore under capitalism they were much more successful than under socialism, and that's what built them into economic powers, or collectively they were economic powers as a whole, the Nordic states, up until the late 1970s and 80s, when they started to slip a bit because they were implementing more socialist policies, more nationalizations, and then they went back on it. So maybe some of the elements of their society are socialist, and unfortunately those elements, even though they're privatizing a lot of businesses, and by the way, in Sweden, maybe we can do a different video about their privatizations, but the real problem with the social democratic model is that it also legitimizes laws that encroach on freedom, never mind on people's income, but on their freedom of expression. That's why in Sweden they have some of the strictest laws on gender equality and on pronouns and anti-racism laws, so that people can't say anything about anybody. It's one of the most absurd governments in the world when it comes to that. Yes, maybe people have a relatively high standard of living, but not when you go into the slums of the country. Malmo nowadays. Malmo, I think, is Sweden's second largest city. Is considered one of the most dangerous cities in Europe because of mass migration. Well, social democratic ideas legitimized that. It said that, yes, we need to extend our, open our homes to these people, regardless of the fact of whether we're capable of sustaining them, which is wrong, I think, both for the migrants and for the host population. I think it's that type of thinking, that the collective must band together to serve the interests of somebody else. I think it sounds very nice until you really get down to the specifics and you realize that sometimes the best type of help is not giving a hand, and or maybe even helping from afar.
Problems for millennia in a wide variety of places and in different forms. Sumeria, circa 2100 BC, had a state-planned economy. Food was directly distributed through the state. Evidence of their bureaucracies can be found written on tens of thousands of clay tablets that were excavated in modern-day Iraq. The Code of Hammurabi in Babylonia around 1750 BC fixed the wages of workers and capped how much physicians were allowed to charge their patients. In Egypt, during the Ptolemaic dynasty from 323 to 30 BC, the state controlled the means of production and every aspect of commerce. The government owned all of the land and decided what crops should be grown and...
Slave society, people could be used as slaves. You couldn't go anywhere you wanted. You were forced to sacrifice to certain gods. This idea that, we like these socialist elements of these societies. Yes, socialist elements up against the backdrop of societies that are blatantly not socialistic. They worshipped a man as a god, a living man, the pharaoh. They worshipped him as a god. So for these societies to be held up as paragons of socialism is really, I think it's the height of dishonesty for him. Yes, there were price fixing. You want to talk about price fixing, which is what wage sets are. He was talking about with Babylon, that they set wages to be equal. That's not an element of an equal society, because kings and monarchs have been able to fix prices for years. They can raise the price of grain too. They can blow it through the roof. Sure. I mean, really think about it. He's arguing here that being able to set the prices of commodities makes you a socialist society than America, which we do set the price of ethanol, for example. We use subsidies. We set the price of health insurance in many cases with Obamacare. That does not socialism make. It makes for basically a price-fixed economy, a corrupted market. It's not a free market. It does not necessarily mean socialism. It's a controlled economy, but it's not a centrally planned economy. It's on the road to socialism. If you keep going, you might not get there. If they keep doing it that way, they simply sabotage capitalism. But it doesn't always lead to socialism, because it's happened in regimes, throughout history that didn't become socialist immediately thereafter. I mean, it used to be monarchs all across Europe or in Asia. They would set the prices of various products, and then they would see the results. I mean, in some cases, maybe it did work, but it wasn't an issue of this is ridiculous. This is the same as when they try to claim that roads are socialist, even though in Tsarist Russia and in Francoist Spain, they had roads. They didn't stop making roads, but they weren't socialist.
Where? It controlled the mines, the production of oil, salt, paper, textiles, everything. Emperor Diocletian, during the 3rd century BC, Rome responded to harmful monopolies and widespread poverty and unemployment by nationalizing all major industries and creating tons of public work projects. The Chinese Emperor Wu of Han in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, to combat growing monopolies and wealth inequality, established an income tax, nationalized natural resources, regulated trade, fixed prices, and established public works. The longest-lasting use of socialism is thought to be the Incan economic system between the 13th and 16th centuries. Everyone in the society collectively organized every aspect of agriculture, labor, trade, and transportation, and a census kept track of materials, individuals, and income. The Incan people graciously participated in this system in exchange for security and food, and it worked despite the massive size of the Incan territory, and it only fell apart because of the arrival of the Spanish in 1533.
So he's trying to use socialist societies. For example, the Incans, yes, they were a very sparse society. If you look at, the Andes Mountains, it was stretched, I think, from northern Chile all the way to southern Colombia, mainly in the Peru and Ecuador regions. And these were societies that they were monarchies, first of all. So you did not have an equitable society. They had god emperors. In Rome, they had god emperors. And this idea that this causes an equal society, no, it's not an equal society. And for them to claim that this is socialism, I think it would be a very strange form of socialism to the people advocating for socialism today. It's really these are people that you're essentially claiming that you're going to use a 64 Mustang in order to produce 93 Ford Escort because they're both Fords. Well, they may both be Fords, but there's a lot of features on the 64 Mustang that the Ford Escort doesn't have, and vice versa. It's simply not the same.
Responding to someone claiming that socialism has never worked, I would remind them that to the extent that socialism has been tried, where ideas and tendencies of democratic, egalitarian, left-wing socialism have been woven into political and economic life, and haven't been nullified by right-wing phenomena like totalitarianism, police states, and oligarchy, the results have been good. The right wing of...
So I'd be very curious how he would characterize the French Revolution as a right-wing totalitarian state, because this was a state where the whole point was to erase the church and do away with traditional French culture. So, there's so many ways where these people, they just twist words. They use right wing. I'll say very clearly, there are people on the left that are not socialist at all. There's people on the left that are, they're more socially liberal and then economically conservative, and they consider themselves on the left. It's a very You know, it's a much more tangled web than people have traditionally outlined. But now to claim that the Soviet Union and other states such as the Soviet Union didn't start out as a totalitarian state, but the elements of quote unquote egalitarian socialism, they degenerated. Once again, they didn't come out of nowhere, okay? And one of these equitable states where people are cooperative and there is no hierarchy, like he claims happened in Spain, they don't last very long because they're weak societies and the individual is weak there. And it's still communalist. So once the leaders or you know, the would-be leaders, because they can't necessarily they can't necessarily come out as real leaders, because then they would be violating the tenets of socialism. Once they have to really put the hammer down in order to get what they need, they end up killing their rivals. And this idea that this is a right-wing issue, it has nothing to do with right-wing. It has to do with structure. It has to do with the order of society. And you know, people are not used to living in an anarchic society, a society where there is no hierarchy, where you don't know who you're supposed to report to, or you know, what you're supposed to do today. At least not in an industrial society. Now there's certain industries where that doesn't really matter. You know, creative industries like art, where that's not really an issue. But you can't use that as the general rule.
Or conservative or classical liberal dogma in the U.S. is that higher taxes and a strong public sector are just awful. They say these things inhibit economic growth and innovation, or that the welfare state and thorough regulation of markets is unsustainable, or even that these things endanger individual liberty. As progressives, we know that's not true, or really anyone who looks at the data or has studied truly democratic applications of socialism would know that's not true. Look at...
Okay, he's bringing up those Nordic states, which he's already admitted. And by the way, the Prime Minister of Denmark came out and said that no, to Bernie Sanders, we're not socialist. I want to leave you with one thought, because I'm not going to give Pakman the last word, and I'm running up to an hour, which I didn't want to do, but you know, it was worth it. As good as these societies are, we still have people from Scandinavia immigrating to America, but hardly anybody from America migrates to Scandinavia. Don't you think that's a little odd? Don't you think it's odd that Japanese people don't migrate to Scandinavia? They don't migrate to socialist countries. Don't you think that's a little weird that people that are from first world capitalist countries like South Korea, they don't decide, it's not equal enough here, I'm going to move to socialist, socialist Sweden, if you can even call it that. They don't do it because it's not worth it. If they want anything different from Japan, they're going to come here, because this is the country with the capitalism that we have that allows you to be an individual and succeed on your own. And over there, they just make up new ways to complicate life and constrain it and put more rules in place. And, you know, we're seeing them fail. We're seeing them slip into the muck. And I'll be very amused when David Pakman comes up with a new excuse for why Sweden is no longer democratic socialism once it abandons it entirely.